Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to see so many of you. I can see a century of participants, quite appropriate because our distinguished speaker tonight is a keen cricket enthusiast. But that's not what we're going to be talking about on this rather wet and cold e evening here in Britain. So, a warmish welcome to Caabu members, future members, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening because tonight's talk and indeed book launch is of, I think, real seminal importance. So, we are launching this great tome here, Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. And I think that all of you will be sadly and painfully familiar with all that's gone on in Gaza over the last couple of years. But to take us through this and how Britain is complicit, we have the author, the wonderful Peter Oborne. You've all seen his bio, but he's an author, broadcaster, journalist of great distinction. He's currently the associate editor of Middle East Eye, but formerly, as you know, he was the political editor at the Spectator, columnist, political columnist at the Mail, and indeed the Telegraph. So he is somebody who knows the British political establishment inside out, the media world inside out, but also the Middle East. And because of that, he is this fusion of expertise. He's particularly well placed to write such a book, looking at how Britain is complicit in all that has gone on in Israel, Palestine. And it's not only those talents, of course, it's his writing skills, the clarity of his writing, but also his moral clarity that stands out in all of this. So, Peter, thank you very, very much for joining us and today at Caabu. I just want to start off really just by saying, how's the book gone down? I think it's rather noticeable. Is it still the case that the mainstream media is rather ignoring your great work?
Oh, absolutely. It's in fact not been reviewed by any mainstream media outlet, from the Financial Times to the Telegraph, the Times, etc. Just blanked it, which I think is naughty. Um, it has been reviewed in Declassified and Jacobin has just published a good review, a very thoughtful review. But I think the spectre of the mainstream media is completely ignored, blank, not attacked. It's like I was expecting perhaps I would be attacked, but not at all. It's just as if this book doesn't exist as far as the book's editors are concerned.
No, absolutely. And normally I wouldn't sort of point this out with an author, but I think actually it's the topic of your book. It's the thesis that is so disturbing to the mainstream media. It's not the quality of your publication, which really is excellent. But I think I really perhaps should start. Let's have a look at the second part of your title, just to remind you Britain's role in the destruction of Gaza. Let's go to Gaza because I think that this is so fundamental. What we are talking about is what has happened there. And for you, Peter, is it complicity in genocide that we're dealing with in Gaza?
Well, I'm careful to say this that most experts, scholars say it's a genocide. Most kind of human rights organizations, almost all of them say it's a genocide. And on the other hand, there is a body of view opinion which it isn't a genocide. That's what the Prime Minister says, the British Prime Minister. Indeed, the Foreign Secretary says that. The leader of the Tory party says that, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Now, they're quite clear that it isn't a genocide, and I think we are awaiting the verdict of the International Court of Justice. But you can say most experts say it's a genocide, and more importantly, legally, all leading politicians have been put on notice that there is a plausible genocide, a risk of genocide um, in um, in Gaza, and they were put on notice on January the 26th last in 2024, almost more than 2 years ago, in that historic, momentous judgment by the International Court of Justice. And so they know they can't. They absolutely were warned. And so the fact that Britain has continued to supply arms, more and more of them, that we have been heavily involved in intelligence gathering, so through the surveillance overflights and doubtless other reasons that we've been training Israeli soldiers, had very strong military connections. Generally, the air base in Cyprus has been absolutely crucial to that. The diplomatic support has been crucial. The failure to call out the the U.S. attack on the International Criminal Court, which was the U.S. has sanctioned it. It can't really do its job because most of those working there, I understand, haven't got bank accounts anymore. They're being, and actually in some cases, physically threatened. It's reported, and you'd have thought, and so the British government generally, whether the Conservatives or Labour, are deeply complicit in all of this.
Nevertheless, you've called it the destruction of Gaza, which I think is was fair given the scale. I mean,
Mm.
92% of all buildings have been, bombed. You've seen the destruction of civilian infrastructure. So even if it's not genocide, and I think your point is well made, there's a risk of it. That's what the ICJ has determined. There's still surely evidence there we can't really dispute of war crimes and crimes against humanity,
Yeah.
and the ICC has come forward. So we're talking serious crimes that you're accusing Britain of being complicit in.
Yes, I mean, there's no question that war crimes have been committed, and if you just need to read the very serious reports from the human rights organizations or the reporting by the journalists on the ground, immense heroism. And yet the British government doesn't. This point isn't made nearly enough. Does not. It does not say that crimes are being committed. Uh, the nearest they got was there was a risk of crimes being committed when David Lammy, I think, made that statement, just cutting down very slightly the amount of arms which were being sold. And then we had, of course, the Wes Streeting moment last week, when, courtesy of in the aftermath of Epstein, the health secretary saw fit to publicly issue his email correspondence with Peter Mandelson, where he, last July, that's 8 months ago now, he expressed the view to Peter Mandelson, but quite clearly, that war crimes are being committed. This is very, very important moment because it tells you that there is an embedded knowledge in the cabinet and the government. And it's important to state that he seemed to have been briefed by doctors. Now, I dare say they're the same doctors who we've met, who've been out there witnessing the carnage and the atrocities and giving and how children are being targeted. It's quite terrible stuff. And Wes Streeting will have heard all of that, and yet he's happy to be part of a government which won't even say that war crimes are being committed.
And he also went further. I mean, he called Israel a pariah state, a rogue, it should be sanctioned. It shouldn't just be a couple of ministers. And yet he's the only cabinet minister who's indicated these sorts of views at all. I mean, he seems to be, strangely enough, almost a lonely voice in the political firmament at the top table.
Except, of course, that these views were expressed privately
And
to a close friend, which happened to be published because of the political predicament 10 days ago. And it is very troubling that he didn't say them publicly. It raises massive issues about why he's chosen to stay in the government when what appears to be what most experts say is a genocide is going on, and he's been briefed about it. So the huge questions, I think, for Wes Streeting. Actually, and I would have expected by now the British media to have done its job and put him under pressure to say, does he stand by these views he expressed in his private. You wrote an excellent piece, by the way, in Middle East Eye for the for which I work, setting out the implications, the consequences of what he said. Does he stand by these views? Does he repudiate them? Will he say publicly that Israel should be sanctioned? All of these things are up in the air. But has there been any media? Has he been asked any questions by the Laura Kearnsbergs of this world?
I certainly haven't heard that at all.
No.
It is extraordinary. And going back to your point, which is so important, that the British government, I mean, still today will not openly say that Israel has violated international law. I mean, it's particularly when it comes to Gaza. Strangely, they have a stronger position in the West Bank. And I'm sure viewers will, and listeners will remember that David Lammy actually was compelled by Downing Street to walk back a comment where he said Israel had been violating international law. But these are Labour figures. If we go back to the earlier period after October 2023, we had the Sunak government. How, you wrote a lot about this in your book, and of course, you did a documentary that included a lot on the Conservative Party's links to Israel and the pro-Israel lobby within the party. How do you see that Sunak government and what it did in that first period of all the atrocities that have gone on?
Yeah, there were several things which the Sunak government did. The first was Sunak's morally disturbing remark that he was giving unequivocal support to Netanyahu. Now, he made this remark very quickly after the 7th of October, and that was a green light, because even by then he would have been being told by British security sources that Israel was basically slaughtering about 400 to 500 people a day at that point. And you'd already had the genocidal comments made by the senior political echelon from the president downwards.
And wars beforehand in 2009, 12, 14, where violations had happened. So,
Yeah, but it was on a much bigger scale. It is, of course, the case that in Cast-led or Protective Edge or the March of Return, which we might talk about that, the British governments, whether they were Tory or Labour, they were Tory governments, weren't they? I think for all those three events.
for Cast-led, it was Labour.
It was right for Labour, whether Labour or Tory, they just threw their weight behind Israel. There was never any equivocation about it. That was the position. And in fact, what happened after 7th of October, that we had a cross-party cartel formed between the Conservatives and Labour. So Keir Starmer went even further than Rishi Sunak by saying he supported collective punishment, i.e. withholding, I think it was water and fuel. So there was they were locked in together, and they had this uncomfortable, but there you are, the far right. They had Farage with them. They had Tommy Robinson with them, and there's this block from the far right, the most ferociously and viciously right-wing members of the British political firmament, to the kind of centre left of the Labour Party. It is worth remembering that some Labour MPs did honourably resign when that first ceasefire motion was voted on in November. I mean, I think of Andy Slaughter, who was destined to be Solicitor General, but he voted for a ceasefire, and he's now has been a backbencher ever since. Do you think people listening would like to hear about the launch of the Palestinian embassy? You and I were there.
We were.
You were in the posh seats. You were in the there was there was a sort of fence cutting off the very important people like you and Hassam Zomlot and Wes Streeting, and then there was those of us who just come along to support the recognition of the Palestinian state, and I watched Hassam Zomlot put the flag up, and the Palestinian flag, very, very moving moment. And he was around him. You were a little detached from the central group. There was Hamish Faulkner and Wes Streeting. Wes Streeting being health secretary. It wasn't quite clear why he was there, but there he was. And Hassan gave a very good speech, went on about the genocide, and I had a perfect view of their faces of Hamish Faulkner and Wes Streeting. And Wes Streeting actually looked, the rictus grin was something to behold. And Hamish Faulkner looked quite ill. It was very difficult for them, but I can see why politically why Streeting was there with his slender majority in Ilford. And he was even then, obviously knew there was a genocide, although he wasn't, or not a genocide. So he knew that war crimes had been committed, but of course that wasn't something he considered important enough to make an issue of in the cabinet.
Mm. And I mean, Sunak and Cameron, I mean, we saw the reaction to the ICJ issuing
Sunak and
additional
Cameron were
measures.
quite disgraceful. First of all, they attacked the South Africans for bringing the case, and then when the ICJ reached its finding or its ruling, they attacked the ICJ ruling. Then Cameron, then do you remember in a sort of in a move to try and distract attention, I think Netanyahu suddenly unveiled claims that UNRWA was there on was UNRWA were providing fighters on October the 7th, issued a sort of flimsy piece of paper to various news organizations. Within hours, the wretched Cameron, that's appropriate word, the wretched Cameron had suspended British funding to UNRWA, the major source of humanitarian funding to people in a crisis. He fell for it straight away. He wouldn't. I still remember the pathetic performance he put up in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee when he came under a certain amount of flack from Brendan O'Hara of the SNP. And it needs to be said that the minority parties have been excellent. The SNP, Plaid Cymru, in particular, and and Cameron forgot, well, didn't know whether he'd been told it was that Israel was committing war crimes. He was a shambles, and it was if we'd had a decent leader of the opposition, he could have eaten Cameron alive in the House of Commons. Just imagine what John Smith, which is the last really principal leader in this field we've had, would have done to Cameron after that, performance, or Robin Cook, as Shadow Foreign Secretary. But with Lammy and Starmer, there was no criticism of Cameron's inept performance. And then, of course, there was this matter which is still rather unresolved, but it is quite disgraceful, even by what he agrees has happened, when Cameron made an intervention on the International Criminal Court investigation into Netanyahu and Gallant for alleged war crimes. And Cameron personally rang up Karim Khan and told him, according to the sources which Middle East Eye has got, they threatened him that he would withdraw funding from the ICC and possibly withdraw from the Rome statutes unless Karim Khan abandoned this project to put arrest warrants on Netanyahu and Gallant. The account from the Cameron side is that isn't quite right, but they accept the call happens, which in itself is an intervention, is a shocking intervention in the course of justice. Forget whether or not what the Middle East Eye journalists are saying, and and also they accept that he raised that matter, and they more said there are elements in the Conservative Party which would be very upset, and also. We now know that on that call we've had extracted information from the Foreign Office that no official was present, which is when a conversation between the Foreign Secretary and the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, you would expect an official to be
Absolutely.
present, but it would be automatic. So there's something very fishy about Cameron's conversation with Karim Khan, and his general role is disgraceful and brings shame on himself. It brings disgrace on the Conservative Party and shames our country.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the presence of an official, and I remember actually when an edict went out to ministers that you had to have an official if you were meeting with external bodies, for example, including Caabu, in order, if anything else, to back them up, in order that you couldn't have any dispute over the facts of what had been discussed. So the absence of an official actually, I think, opens the door for legitimate accusations about what's going on. So the Conservatives failed on UNRWA, the ICC, the ICJ failed to call it out. Now, Labour ministers would come back to you and say, Peter Oborne, we did change things. We restored UNRWA funding. We imposed an arms embargo, at least on most things. We've sanctioned two ministers. Surely the Labour Party doesn't deserve the sort of criticism that you've made of them.
Well, no, I do. I stress all of that in my book. I mean, I'm determined to be completely fair, and absolutely we give Labour, David Lammy and Starmer credit for letting up on the ICC, for resuming funding for UNRWA, and indeed for cutting arms sales. Not, I mean, it was a very small cut, and actually they've gone up. The volume has gone up, and the critical provision of parts for F-35s, which have done so much damage in Gaza, that was unchanged. Nevertheless, I give them a lot of certain amounts of credit. It wasn't nearly enough, but then I think what I would point to against the Prime Minister is his failure to stick up for international law. He's one of the most distinguished international lawyers on the planet, and over not to stand up for the ICC, not to challenge the attacks on the United Nations by the United States, then I think his kind of allowing Tony Blair to get involved with the Board of Peace. And I think that also the failure now to impose sanctions on Israel. I mean, it's given what is happening in the West Bank, where communities after communities are being erased now, particularly across north of the West Bank, and now more effectively it has been annexed. But like today's great decision, terrible decision to turn much of the West Bank into state land, the British government comes up with little sort of it condemns, doesn't it? We have condemnation or whatever, but they cannot even bring themselves to sanction products produced in the settlements. And given that, so that makes us very part of the problem, because a lot of these settlements, they sell to Britain, vegetables and fruit, and that's and they are being supported by the British state. And I cannot understand why they won't do that. I think they should go much further now. Actually, I think they should clap all sorts of sanctions on Israel. And I think it's too late now because. And I think BDS has to be applied. I mean, given what is the continuing atrocities which Israel is committing.
For sure. I think the other thing I would add into the mix there is that the International Court of Justice that Starmer is meant to be backing issued a really historic
Yes, of course.
advisory opinion in July 2024 saying that the occupation, both of Gaza and the West Bank, was unlawful. And we know that essentially the Prime Minister's been sitting on the advice that's drawn up pretty much within months of that time, and they're still not publishing.
Still considering their response. So a very strong instruction from the International Court of Justice that Israel's presence, mere presence in the West Bank and the occupied territories is against the law. They've had an instruction to pull out. Israel's been instructed to remove itself from the West Bank, haven't they, in that historic judgment. And Britain can't respond, seems unable to respond to that because they don't want to upset Netanyahu. It stares you in the face, or Trump. I mean, it's pathetic.
And I think there are legal consequences if you say the occupation is unlawful, that you can't have anything to do with it, which would include a ban on settlement products. Peter, I mean, one thing that's always struck me is remarkable is this issue of the overflights which you mentioned earlier, going out over Akrotiri, that continued until October with the ceasefire agreement. They were stopped after that. But for 2 years, Britain did this. Why? I mean, why were we, doing that when there was a risk, an acknowledged risk that international law was being violated?
Yeah, and the conversations around it are quite strange. In other words, Britain ministers won't give a. I think I'm right. You put me like that weren't given assurance that the intelligence given to Israel won't be used for their own purposes.
Mm.
It's worth saying that I think you've probably maybe you already have Phil Miller at Declassified and Matt Kennard have done amazing work on this, bringing it to light. And I haven't got anything to add to what they've done, except that it is notable that is another example of the failure of the British media that they kept on bringing new and troubling information to light about British involvement. And one notes also that Martin Shaw, one of Britain's leading genocide scholars, said this means it's more than complicity, this is collusion, what we're
Mm.
doing. But there's been no attempt really no attempt by the mainstream media to follow up this very important work. It's an example of how the BBC and co are a part of the occupation in many ways, a part, have fanning the genocide because they're not publishing awkward information. And it should be a massive story whether or not Britain and to exactly what Britain is doing. Do we have troops on the ground? There have been suggestions and so on and so forth. Or the failure to really, did you see it followed up anywhere that 2,000 British citizens apparently have been fighting with the Israeli forces in what is a genocidal army?
As dual nationals,
Well, they're British citizens, yeah.
the
So,
British citizens,
yeah.
and yeah, there's no inquisitiveness, and this brings me on of what I wanted to come to you next. It's your own profession. I mean, the performance of the media throughout this. The last time you and I were speaking together was on a panel to launch the report that Caabu helped with the Centre for Media Monitoring about the BBC's coverage. So, I mean, how do you rate your fellow professionals in the media over all of this?
It's
What
quite
degree of complicity do they have?
well. Let's go through what they've done, starting on October the 7th and the aftermath. At that point, they got involved in what is atrocity propaganda. In other words, we got the 40 beheaded babies and all the stories around that. And that was all the papers, essentially. And of course, we now know those stories. Two babies were killed, none of them deliberately. Neither of them. It's terrible, it's a tragedy, but they weren't deliberately killed by Hamas or anybody else. They were killed accidentally, I think. I'm right in saying, it's a terrible situation. And so all the reporting, I mean, it's not as if Hamas hadn't committed plenty of atrocities, but they even got those wrong. I mean, because they invented atrocities or allowed themselves to be briefed by certain organizations about atrocities which hadn't actually happened, and they splashed on them. So that was atrocity propaganda was thing one. Thing two is atrocity denial. And so they've not reported properly the full scale of what Israel has committed. I mean, for instance, the torture and killing in many cases of prisoners in Israeli jails. It's been very well documented, including, it should be said, on Israeli, on Israeli media. You get a much clearer idea of what's actually happening from, even the Jerusalem Post, which is not exactly a pro-lefty organization, but you're actually going to learn more about what's happening. The media will not cover stories which embarrass or are difficult for Israel generally. That's atrocity denial. And then I think there's the issue of omission. I mean, the BBC, you were there, you saw me do it, put it to the head of news content at the BBC. Why didn't you mention the Dahiya doctrine, you can't understand what's happened in Gaza without knowing that this doctrine was applied, and it was invented in 2006 by Israeli generals in order, and it was the idea is you can kill or damage as much civilian infrastructure as you like in order to send a tough message. And that is basically what we've seen since October the 7th. Now, but there was no explanation about it. Or the Hannibal Directive, which is the doctrine that you kill your own people rather than let them become hostages. That was, it's a tough directive. I can see the arguments for it, but it, there's no question. Quite a number of Israelis were killed by the IDF that day, and that wasn't explained. So you don't get, there's a general failure to explain what's actually happening. And the game now with the ceasefire, today, last night, is it 10 or 11 Palestinians have been killed, and that's being reported as it was after Hamas breached the ceasefire. Have you looked at the headlines? I mean, it's very odd, this reporting. Actually, there was a moment in May, but this time last year, about March last year, when Israel broke the ceasefire. And at that point, there was a change in mood, and you had the language had Trump and others talking the language of ethnic cleansing, the Riviera in Gaza. And at that point, it became difficult for the British government. It was tougher on Israel, certainly, but the media changed its tune a bit.
Mm.
Jeremy Bowen eventually mentioned the G word, I think, in one of his articles, and I may be wrong about that, but or certainly war crimes. He certainly started to stick his neck out a bit.
Mm.
But if anything, I think the media is now more pro-Israel than it was this time last year.
I think if I recall, what Jeremy Bowen did was to assess the merits for and against whether genocide was happening.
I know you didn't
He
say that genocide was
introduced the
happening. No.
whole
Yeah.
debate. And of course, you had that. Well, so many interviews where the presenter on the BBC and indeed occasionally on other channels would, if a UN expert or some other legal guru would come on, and the presenter would say, "Oh, but Israel denies this," and they become almost like the Israeli embassy spokesperson in that process, as if this was, the Russian spokesperson, that they would, say similar things. It's absolutely, nonsense. So we got the media there is another part of it. Now, you actually put quite a bit of your book into as one real case study, which I wanted to draw out because it is in one of your chapters about the whole issue of football and
Yeah.
Maccabi. And this brings us to how the media and the politicians have treated those people also who have stuck up for Palestinians. And we've had all stuff on hate marches and all the rest of it. You might want to say something about Palestine Action too. But tell us what you found in your research on the whole, Maccabee issue of the fans and so forth in Amsterdam and then Aston Villa.
Well, if you look at the events of November? Was it November last year? No, yeah, November last year or November the year before when the Maccabee fans went to the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and it was framed immediately as anti-Jewish pogroms. And we talked to the a camera woman who likes filming the police. She's very impressive, Annette, and she'd taken film. The only person who had done in the central square. She'd waited for the Maccabee fans to turn up, and she filmed Maccabee fans chasing locals. She then gave the footage to Reuters and other agencies, and her footage was presented as locals chasing Maccabee fans. It was actually turned on its head,
Mm.
and incredibly lazy. And we went through this with Annette. She's very professional. They have what is known as some sort of briefing document which goes out. It explains exactly what has happened. She saw it was being misreported. She got in touch with these agencies, and and they would ignored her. That's an example of what the kind of thing we're talking about. But you get much grosser, well, even grosser misreporting. For instance, when in order to defend himself in February 2024, the Speaker of the House of Commons, having killed off the SNP ceasefire motion quite disgracefully after being pressured, it seems, by the Prime Minister, then the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, after being put in what looked like a very third-degree conversation. He broke convention, came under pressure. He then turns up in the House of Commons and says, "Oh, I was doing it for the safety of MPs." Now, he didn't name who was threatening the safety of MPs, but Michael Gove did. He gave an interview with the Sun, said that, let's look after the ref, and it's these Islamists, and this was the narrative that the MPs were being threatened by Islamists, anti-Semites, terror supporters, and I spent about 3 weeks going through all the footage, both outside Parliament and inside TV studios, and you would find very distinguished. It just became a social fact that there'd been a violent mob outside Parliament threatening the lives of MPs, and I checked every single case mentioned. There was not any truth in this at all. And that is an example of how the media played a very important role in attacking the protesters and in demonizing creating a moral panic around the protesters, who I think are marvelous. They are in the great tradition, as I always now tell them, of the suffragettes or the ban the bomb you don't have to agree with them, but it's just this is a great noble tradition of protest.
Indeed. Now, we're going to take some questions we've got from our participants. I think because we've got quite a few, I will read them out. So, Hooky Walker has put in a question here. And he's saying, it's easy to understand why the US supports Israel so strongly. It's almost impossible to get elected to Congress without the support of AIPAC. That's the main American pro-Israel lobbying group. So, what in brief, Peter, is your explanation for the strong support of the two British political parties? I mean, why are we so desperate to back this country in the Eastern Mediterranean, no matter the reputational costs?
Well, the first reason is that British foreign policy is a bit pathetic. And it's not about Israel so much as about the United States. And Starmer, because I remember discussing it with you before the last election. So, because Sir Keir Starmer was very clear to his members of his shadow cabinet that he was doing it to do nothing which would have upset his relationship with the United States. He wanted to show that he was pro-Israel, and since Biden wouldn't, as we know, wouldn't lift a finger to criticize Netanyahu, that was what Starmer did too. There is also a very strong pro-Israel lobby in Parliament, in the main two parties, and in other spheres, as we know, not unlike AIPAC, but not nearly as powerful, I would say, as AIPAC. And it's quite difficult to judge exactly how influential it is, because often it may be pushing the British government into a line of policy which it was going to do anyway. It's difficult judgments to make. There's no question that has been influential, I think, in the Conservative Party,
Mm.
particularly because the Conservative Friends of Israel was a very formidable organization. It was able, by the end, as I demonstrate, it was breaching the usual procedures, and having direct relationships with conservative ministers, rather than statements would be made to them, the CFI, not to the floor of the House of Commons, important policy issues. It was a very close relationship.
Yes, I remember when Liz Truss, For those who recall her period in office. In her leadership campaign, it was to the Conservative Friends of Israel hustings that she announced that she would move the British Embassy to Jerusalem. But fortunately, we managed to see that off.
And
Now,
by the way, and in those hustings, Sunak, who was her main competitor, he felt he needed to agree. He also made that commitment,
yeah,
although after the 44 days of trust, when he became prime minister, he reneged on it, which is interesting. So
yeah,
they weren't able to get as far as they hoped.
yeah. Now, we got a question from Liha Nahul. Are Jeremy Bowen, Lucy Williamson, and Fergal Keane being restrained by senior BBC officials as to what they can say? So, I guess this is a question, Peter, as to do you think that BBC management, rather than the journalists themselves, are the ones more responsible for the poor coverage?
Yeah, one should look at this analytically. I mean, what if you look at Jeremy Bowen, who's under ferocious attack today by the pro-Israel lobby? He's being accused of all kinds of bias and prejudice, and there are calls for him to resign as we speak. I'd say he's a pretty good correspondent. I'd say that he knows exactly the situation. I think he's seasoned, he's brave. I think he's an honour to he's represent the BBC very well. I, but the problem is just the management back at home and also the domestic political team. Because I think one of the things I see as somebody who was a political correspondent is that they've never made the lobby arms sales to Israel a political story. Because it's not just what the reporting from the ground in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and you also need the political story. Pressure is mounting for a arms sales and then revelation to stop arms sales. The pressure is mounting for sanctions. The ministers, and they haven't been the domestic lobby, whether it's BBC journalists or political journalists on other papers. I think they're terrified of reporting Israel, is what I think, because they don't understand it. They've not really been there, and they don't know. They know that if they make one false step, there's going to be a wave of letters and complaints, and then they don't want to have an awkward relationship with their managing editor or whatever it may be. I'm sure that, and so it's never become a domestic story, is what is quite important. Now, the BBC bosses are simply pathetic. And as we discovered on that panel, when the head of news content was on, didn't even know what the Dahia doctrine was. He never heard of Avi Shleim, I don't think. I said, why hasn't Avi Shleim ever been on the BBC? The leading, I mean, he's Jewish, he was in the IDF, he's the leading global historian of Israel. But he's never been on he lives in Oxford. He was a professor of international relations there. He's still 100% compost. And somehow the BBC's managed not to bring him on. And it's obvious that has to be a deliberate decision. They haven't had Avi Shleim on because he's a critic of Israel, so they don't want him on. Same with Ilan Pape. But I don't think he'd actually heard of Avi Shleim. I mean, he's a very thick man. He's a man actually responsible for news content. I don't think he knew what I was talking about. Did you get that impression?
I don't think he knew either. It is quite remarkable. And I agree with you just in answer to the question. I mean, I think largely BBC managers, and I had a number of meetings with the Director General, head of news content and editors, and you just got the feeling that they were terrified of the whole thing. But I think there's another question that comes into this for you, Peter, the way in which we've seen BBC coverage also being politicized. So you had the coverage of the concert at Glastonbury. You had other bits of BBC coverage where, Lisa Nandy, as the culture secretary, would, storm into the Commons and, give a dressing down to the BBC, and the BBC seemed to cave in.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, this is, I would have thought a decent, head of the BBC would have said, "Hold on, we're an independent broadcaster, and we're going to stand our ground here. We'll do the investigations. Thank you very much.
Yes, and that's what
Government
I think the
interference is not
BBC.
welcome.
That's what the BBC would have done 20 years ago, and they did.
Yeah.
There were attempts 25 years ago, during the Second Intifada and before,
Hmm.
to go after. Jeremy Burns been through the mill before. He was a great thing about him, and I think it was not least to set as one of his colleagues who was awful abuse from the Israelis, and the BBC management at the time had the self-confidence to deal with it. Whereas, unfortunately, Samir Shah, the new chairman, is, well, they're not that new anymore, is obviously a wee frit thing. Tim Davie was not a journalist. He was a marketing man. It was the new idea that you put a marketing man in charge of news. Bizarre. I don't know how that happens. And you do notice that they are put there by the Tories. I think it's very.
Yeah. So we've got another question from Juliana Farhad and wants to know if you think that the government's resistance to acknowledging Israeli war crimes is strategic or ideological. So, is it because they're ideologically sympathetic to Israel, or they think it's part of geopolitics that they should have to do this?
It's a very good and interesting question, and the answer is it's probably both. In the case of Rishi Sunak, I would say it was quite ideological. The Conservative Friends of Israel, by the end of the last 10 years, has run the most desirable parties at Tory conferences. It funds a lot of the activities of MPs, I think. It takes loads of MPs on trips, and they ideologically agree with a lot of them with this analysis which Netanyahu has basically brought to the world, that we are fighting a clash of civilizations, and there's the West against barbarism, and the Palestinians are barbaric. And I kind of think I'm probably caricaturing it a bit. That is the general analysis of a lot of the Tories. In fact, I know it because they say it. Stuff like that. You'll have a look at some of the debates in the last 2 or 3 years on the floor of the House. Now, but I think it's mainly strategic that the view is that we belong to this Western alliance led by the United States, which is about freedom and decency. And on the other side, there's Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. It's a very simplistic view based on a non-understanding of how the world works, and it's based on and overriding it, the United States. We do what the United States says. It's pathetic, actually, because we ought to have our own values, and so I think essentially it's strategic.
And actually, they're going to take two questions here because they're really similar. And asked really, Peter, whether you cover what can be done to hold the UK government to account. So, given the accusation, the very serious accusation of complicity, what can we do? And then what can campaigning groups do to change UK government policy? So, how do we hold them to account? How do we change policy?
Well, you can hold them to account by voting. And obviously, there are lots of other things to vote about, and of course, but actually, in the voting booth, you can hold them to account, if people are feeling energetic and strongly enough about it, by writing letters to your MPs. But also, if you see somebody on the BBC saying something which is false, don't waste your time. But something which is wrong, or they're misattributing something, or you look at all the various ways the BBC massages the Israeli message, or Sky News, write letters. They're going to answer. You can complain to IPSO, which I dare say the Telegraph will be receiving serious letters now that it seems to have misreported the British Library position on Palestine artifacts. Yeah, so that they write letters, go on the marches, and there's a bigger moral point that even if you're wrong, it's very important, not wrong, sorry, even if you don't have any effect, you're sending a wonderful message to Palestine. I can't tell you, I go to the West Bank quite a lot and go to remote villages, and they know about the protests. They really hearten that people care. And also, you're sending a message to the future. There were people who did worry that we were complicit in what may well be determined as a genocide. So the more you can do is the better, and inform yourself.
Mm.
And complain when you see misreporting. Ring up LBC or whatever it's getting on. Brief yourself well. Make sure you come over as a rational person. You know, don't and as you do, by the way, you are what one might call, Chris, you lead the way here. You're very good at presenting pro-Palestinian arguments, which are well informed, based on clear thinking, which are very difficult to argue against. And you've led not just me, you've led me in many ways in helping me form my own judgments now over many years. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. And I think that those bits of advice are very clear. And those who can get to see their members of parliament, please do, because it does make a difference. And we know that because they start telling us. I've heard a lot from our constituents. We got a question from Bishop Michael Doe. How do you assess the role, active pressure, or silent complicity of Jewish communities here in the UK? And I guess I should stress actually that it's quite a wide spectrum of views within those communities. I think it's a question as to sometimes whether the media is guilty of, you know, treating Jewish communities as having a rather a single view, as all being pro-Israeli, which I think is often misleading. But how do you see that, Peter, the Jewish community in its various guises and its reactions?
Yeah, well, there are many, as you said, there are many Jewish communities, and there are plenty of Jewish organizations, people who in touch with who are horrified by what this far right, partly fascist government. It's worth bearing in mind that who's led by somebody who's wanted for alleged war crimes, carrying out the illegal, sanctioning sort of thuggish invasions of destruction across the West Bank, who are horrified. They don't think it is a project which is worthy, in current circumstances, of being supported. And I would criticize the Jewish Chronicle. I would say that it gives very little voice to those very distinguished, thoughtful uh, Jewish Jewish people who I speak to a lot, and I think we need to hear more from them. Uh, I do. I talk to, well, Daniel Levy is a very serious person. You should definitely follow what he says. And he leads the way. Jenny Manson of Jewish Voice has been kicked out of the Labour Party now, but Jewish Voice for Liberation, I think, is very important. But also engage with the other side. I think one of the general problems of the world we've constructed for ourselves, is that we don't talk to each other anymore. And so you're either a sort of fascist Zionist or you're a sort of Islamist extremist. And actually, most people are somewhere not on that spectrum. And and I wish we would talk to each other more. And that seems to be very hard to do. And we need to regain that kind of conversation.
I think that's true, and it's true on so many issues. It's not just this one.
Yes.
This one it happens to be one of the more toxic, the most heated issues that we all deal with. I've got one more question from Francis Clark Clothes here as to the role of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, to what extent it plays a part in, uh, creating fear within the BBC and press and politicians. So, of course, there was the Jerusalem Declaration, or another definition of anti-Semitism. But what are your views on the weaponization of anti-Semitism? Is that something that you deal with in the book?
Very much so. Um, I mean, the IHRA definition does stray into the zone, I think, of conflating criticism of what the state of Israel does with one of the most toxic ideologies which have belonged to our country for hundreds, probably more than 1,000 years. I mean, anti-Semitism. And you can see, I mean, Netanyahu weaponizes anti-Semitism all the time. He just every time he opens his mouth, almost he attacks the Pope for Pope criticizes Israel on human rights grounds. The Pope's an anti-Semite. It's very lazy, and you know, it is an automatic defense, and I think it's outrageous because anti-Semitism is a terrible evil, and if you're going to say you're standing up for the rights of innocent people who are being slaughtered in Gaza is anti-Semitic, which is all that you and I think, try and do sometimes. You're that isn't. I think you'd have to convince me to work very hard to say that is anti-Semitic to do that, and it's not anti-Semitic. You're criticizing the actions of the state of Israel.
Absolutely. And we criticize those people who commit war crimes and atrocities against whoever, as we did with the 7th of October. I think that's
Yes.
absolutely, spot on. And I'll just say something that I think that is not commented on enough is the way in which actually, Netanyahu and other Israeli ministers, and we saw this recently, are perfectly prepared to go to conferences with far-right characters with a dreadful record on issues of racism and indeed anti-Semitism. But as long as, but they will tolerate anti-Semites for Israel. They will
Well,
tolerate,
we saw that
you know,
hideous man, Tommy Robinson, being invited by a Israeli minister to go on a sort of propaganda tour. And Tommy Robinson is a vicious, thuggish person. I think he's anti-Semitic. I'm sure he's definitely anti-Islamophobic. And what Israel is going into a very dark place when it starts to consort with Oborne or Tommy Robinson, etc.
but also the record of President Trump himself questioning the loyalty of American Jews, saying that you're not going to support me because I don't want your money. Very clear-cut cases of anti-Semitism and the way that
Yeah, yeah.
many in the MAGA right have gone after George Soros as well, and that sort of conspiracy theory of world power that, classic anti-Semitic tropes. Well, we've had a wonderful tour through many of the issues through Peter's wonderful book. And I really do urge you, Joe's put the link up in there to get the book, get it, buy it, digest it. Uh, I suspect there probably, very sadly, may need to be a follow-up at some point in time because even,
Can I say one other thing before you go? I mean, we had dinner before I wrote the book, got settled out on the research project to write, and we had dinner and you had a long conversation, and I think we had many conversations as I was writing it. And I just wanted to put on the record how grateful I am to you for guiding me, and also Joe Willits, who's helped me a lot, and Caabu generally. You really have been so clear and thoughtful, well informed, compassionate, and humane. So I will certainly, if you ask me to come on again, I will gladly do it.
well, we would love to have you on again. And I think the large number of people who've joined us tonight, thank you all very much for joining. That shows an appreciation for your work, your writing, Peter, and what you've done. It really, I cannot recommend this highly enough. Please do get a copy and read it. And please do join us if you're not a member. Help donate because we've got a lot of work in front of us, I'm afraid. It's probably even tougher now with this fake ceasefire period than it was when nobody pretended there was a ceasefire. So please stay with us, join us, and we'll be in touch for future events. But it just remains for me to thank Peter Oborne once again very warmly for all that he's done and for writing that great book.
And
Thank
thanks for
you.
everybody coming and listening because it's very heartening.